Chapter 32 of The Crown of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Crown of Life by George Gissing. Chapter 32. Again it was springtime, the spring of 1894. 2 years had gone by since that April night when Piers Otway suffered things unspeakable in flesh and spirit, thinking that for him the heavens had no more radiance, life no morrow. The memory was faint. He found it hard to imagine that the loss of a woman he did not love could so have afflicted him. Olga Hannaford, Mrs. Florio, was matter for a smile. He hoped that he might some day meet her again and take her hand with the old friendliness and wish her well. He had spent the winter in St. Petersburg and was making arrangements for a visit to England, when one morning there came to him a letter which made his eyes sparkle and his heart beat high with joy. In the afternoon, having given more than wonted care to his dress, he set forth from the lodging he occupied at the lower end of the Nevsky Prospect, and walked to the Hôtel de France, near the Winter Palace, where he inquired for Mrs. Borisoff. After a little delay, he was conducted to a private sitting-room, where again he waited. On a table lay 2 periodicals at which he glanced, recognizing with a smile recent numbers of the 19th century and the Vyestnik Evropy. There entered a lady with a bright English face, a lady in the years between youth and middle age, frank, gracious, her look of interest speaking a compliment which Otway found more than agreeable. "I have kept you waiting," she said, in a tone that dispensed with formalities, "because I was on the point of going out when they brought your card." "Oh, I am sorry." "But I'm not. Instead of twaddle and boredom round somebody or other's samovar, I'm going to have honest talk under the chaperonage of an English teapot, my own teapot, which I carry everywhere. But don't be afraid, I shall not give you English tea. What a shame that I've been here for 2 months without our meeting. I have talked about you, wanted to know you. Look." She pointed to the periodicals which Piers had already noticed. "No," she went on, checking him as he was about to sit down. "That is your chair. If you sat on the other, you would be polite and grave, and like everybody else. I know the influence of chairs. That is the chair my husband selects when he wishes to make me understand some point of etiquette. Miss Derwent warned you, no doubt, of my shortcomings in etiquette." "All she said to me," replied Piers, laughing, "was that you are very much her friend." "Well, that is true, I hope. Tell me, please, is the article in the Vyestnik your own Russian?" "Not entirely. I have a friend named Korolovich, who went through it for me." "Korolovich? I seem to know that name. Is he by chance connected with some religious movement, some heresy?" "I was going to say I am sorry he is, yet I can't be sorry for what honours the man. He has joined the Dukhobortsi, has sold his large estate, and is devoting all the money to their cause. I'm afraid he'll go to some New World colony, and I shall see little of him henceforth. A great loss to me." Mrs. Borisoff kept her eyes upon him as he spoke, seeming to reflect rather than to listen. "I ought to tell you," she said, "that I don't know Russian. Irene, Miss Derwent, almost shamed me into working at it, but I'm so lazy, so lazy. You are aware, of course, that Miss Derwent has learnt it?" "Has learnt Russian?" exclaimed Piers. "I didn't know. I had no idea." "Wonderful girl. I suppose she thinks it a trifle." "It's so long," said Otway, "since I had any news of Miss Derwent. I can hardly consider myself one of her friends. At least, I shouldn't have ventured to do so until this morning, when I was surprised and delighted to have a letter from her about that 19th century article, sent through the publishers. She spoke of you, and asked me to call.
saying she had written an introduction of me by the same post."
Mrs. Borisoff smiled oddly. "Oh, yes, it came. She didn't speak of the Vyestnik?"
"No."
"Yet she has read it, I happen to know. I'm sorry I can't. Tell me about it, will you?" The Russian article was called New Womanhood in England. It began with a good-tempered notice of certain novels then popular, and passed on to speculations regarding the new ideals of life set before English women. Piers spoke of it as a mere bit of apprentice work, meant rather to amuse than as a serious essay. "At all events, it is a success," said his listener. "One hears of it in every drawing-room. Wonderful thing, you don't sneer at women. I'm told you are almost on our side, if not quite. I've heard a passage read into French, The Woman of the 20th Century. I rather liked it."
"Not altogether," said Otway, with humorous diffidence.
"Oh, a woman never quite likes an ideal of womanhood which doesn't quite fit her notion of herself. But let us speak of the other thing in the 19th century. The pilgrimage to Kiev. For life, colour, sympathy, I think it altogether wonderful. I have heard Russians say that they couldn't have believed a foreigner had written it."
"Well, that's the best praise of all."
"You mean to go on with this kind of thing? You might become a sort of interpreter of the two nations to each other. An original idea. The everyday thing is to exasperate Britain against Russ, and Russ against Britain, with every sort of cheap joke and stale falsehood. All the same, Mr. Otway, I'm bound to confess to you that I don't like Russia."
"No more do I," returned Piers in an undertone. "But that only means I don't like the worst features of the Middle Ages. The Russian-speaking cosmopolitan whom you and I know isn't Russia. He belongs to the Western Europe of today. His country represents Western Europe of some centuries ago. Not strictly that, of course, we must allow for race, but it's how one has to think of Russia."
Again Mrs. Borisoff scrutinised him as he spoke, averting her eyes at length with an absent smile. "Here comes my tutelary teapot," she said, as a pretty maidservant entered with a tray. A phrase I got from Irene, by the by, from Miss Derwent, who laughs at me carrying the thing about in my luggage. She has clever little phrases of that sort, as you know.
"Yes," fell from Piers dreamily, "but it's so long since I heard her talk."
When he had received his cup of tea, and sipped from it, he asked with a serious look, "Will you tell me about her?" "Oh, of course I will. But you must first tell me about yourself. You were in business in London, I believe?"
"Well, for about a year. Then I found myself with enough to live upon, and came back to Russia. I had lived at Odessa."
"You may presuppose a knowledge of what came before," interrupted Mrs. Borisoff with a friendly nod.
"I lived for several months with Korolovich on his estate near Poltava. We used to talk. Heavens, how we talked! Sometimes 8 hours at a stretch. I learnt a great deal. Then I wandered up and down Russia, still learning."
"Writing, too?"
"The time hadn't come for writing. Korolovich gave me no end of useful introductions. I've had great luck on my travels."
"And pray, when did you make your studies of English women?"
Piers tried to laugh, declared he did not know.
"I shouldn't wonder if you generalise from one or two," said his hostess, letting her eyelids droop as she observed him lazily. "Do you know Russian women as well?" By begging for another cup of tea, and adding a remark on some other subjects, Piers evaded this question. "And what are you going to do?" asked Mrs. Borisoff. "Stay here and write more articles?"
"I'm going to England in a few days, for the summer."
"That's what I think I shall do.
But I don't know what part to go to. Advise me, can you? Seaside? No, I don't like the seaside. Do you notice how people, our kind of people I mean, are losing their taste for it in England? It's partly, I suppose, because of the excursion train. One doesn't grudge the crowd its excursion train, but it's so much nicer to imagine their blessedness than to see it. Or are you for the other point of view? Otway gave an expressive look. That's right. Oh, the sham philanthropic talk that goes on in England. How it relieves one to say flatly that one does not love the multitude. No seaside, then. Lakes? No. Wales? No. Highlands? No. Isn't there some part of England one would like if one discovered it? Do you want solitude? Asked Piers, becoming more interested. Solitude? She handed a box of cigarettes and herself took one. Yes, solitude. I shall try to get Miss Derwent to come for a time. New Forest? No. Oh, please, please do suggest. I'm nervous. Your silence teases me. Do you know the Yorkshire Dales? Asked Otway, watching her as she watched a nice little ring of white smoke from the end of her cigarette. No. Oh, that's an idea. It's your own country, isn't it? But how do you know that? Dreamt it. I wasn't born there, but I lived there as a child, and later a little. You might do worse than the Dales if you like that kind of country. Wensleydale, for instance. There's an old castle, and a very interesting one. Part of it habitable when you can get quarters. A castle? Superb! Where Queen Mary was imprisoned for a time till she made an escape. Magnificent! Can I have the whole castle to myself? Well, the furnished part of it, unless someone else has got it already for the summer. There's a family, the caretaker's always in possession, if things are still as they used to be. Oh, write for me at once, will you? Oh, write immediately. There's paper on the desk. Piers obeyed. Whilst he sat penning the letter, Mrs. Borisoff lighted a second cigarette, her face touched with a roguish smile. She studied Otway's profile for a moment and became grave, fell into a mood of abstraction, which shadowed her features with weariness and melancholy. Turning suddenly to put a question, Piers saw the change in her look, and was so surprised that he forgot what he was going to say. "Finished?" she asked, moving nervously in her chair. When the letter was written, Mrs. Borisoff resumed talk in the same tone as before. "You have heard of Dr. Derwent's discoveries about diphtheria? That's the kind of thing one envies, don't you think? After all, what can we poor creatures do in this world but to try and ease each other's pain? The man who succeeds in that is the man I honour." "I, too," said Piers, "but he is lost sight of nowadays, in comparison with the man who invents a new gun or a new bullet." "Yes, the beasts!" exclaimed Mrs. Borisoff with a laugh. "What a world! I'm always glad I have no children. But you wanted to speak, not about Dr. Derwent, but Dr. Derwent's daughter." Piers bent forward, resting his chin on his hand. "Tell me about her, will you?" "Oh, there's not much to tell. You knew about the broken-off marriage?" "I knew it was broken off." "Well, that's all anyone knows, except the two persons concerned. It isn't our business. The world talks far too much about such things, don't you think? When we are civilized, there'll be no such things as public weddings, and talk about anyone's domestic concerns will be the grossest impertinence. That's an obiter dictum. I was going to say that Irene lives with her father down in Kent. They left Bryanston Square half a year after the affair. They wander about the continent together now and then. I like that chumming of father and daughter. It speaks well for both." "When did you see her last?" "Oh, about Christmas. We went to a concert together. That's one of the things Irene is going in for, music. When I first knew her, she didn't seem to care much about it, although she played fairly well." "I never heard her play," fell from Piers in an undertone. "No, she only did to please her father now and then. It's her mental and moral advance, her new love of music. I notice that she talks much less about science, much more about the things one really likes. I speak for myself. Well, it's just possible I have had a little influence there. I confess my inability to chat about either physic or physics. It's weak, of course, but I have no place in your new world of women." "Oh, you mistake, I think," said Piers. "That ideal has nothing to do with any particular study. It supposes intelligence, that's all." "So much the better. You must write about it in English, and then we'll debate. By the by, if I go to your castle, you must come down to show me the country." "I should like to." "Oh, that's part of the plan. If we don't get the castle, you must find some other place for me. I leave it in your hands, with an apology for my impudence." After a pause, during which each of them mused, smiling, they began to talk of their departure for England. Otway would go direct in a few days' time. Mrs. Borisoff had to travel a long way round, first of all accompanying her husband to the Crimea on a visit to relatives. She mentioned her London hotel, and an approximate date when she might be heard of there. "Get the castle if you possibly can," were her words as they parted. "I have set my heart on the castle." "So have I," said Piers, avoiding her look. And Mrs. Borisoff laughed. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Crown of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Crown of Life by George Gissing, Chapter 33. Once in the 2 years' interval he had paid a short visit to England. He came on disagreeable business, to see his brother Daniel, who had fallen into the hands of the police on an infamous charge, and only by the exertions of a clever counsel, feed by Piers, received the benefit of a doubt and escaped punishment. Daniel had already written him several begging letters, and when detected in what looked like crime, declared that poverty and ill health were his excuse. He was a broken man. Surmising his hidden life, Piers wondered at the pass a man can be brought to, in our society, by his primitive instincts which may lead, when they are impetuous, either to grimiest degradation or loftiest attainment. To save him, if possible, from the worst extremities, Piers granted him a certain small income to be paid weekly, and therewith bade him final adieu. The firm of Moncharmont & Co. grew in moderate prosperity. Its London representative was a far better man from the commercial point of view than Piers Otway, and on visiting the new offices, which he did very soon after reaching London in the spring of 1894, Piers marvelled how the enterprise had escaped shipwreck during those 12 months which were so black in his memory with storm and stress. The worst 12-month of his life, with the possible exception of that which he spent part at Ewell and part at Odessa. Since he had sailed in no smooth water, had seen no haven, but at least he sailed onward, which gave him courage. Was courage to be now illumined with hope? He tried to keep that thought away from him. He durst not foster it. Among the papers he brought with him to England was a letter which, having laid it aside, he never dared to open again. He knew it by heart, unfortunately for his peace. He returned to another London than that he had known, a London which smiled welcome. It was his duty, no less than his pleasure, to call upon certain people for whom he had letters of introduction from friends in Russia, and their doors opened wide for him. Upon formalities followed kindness, The season was beginning, and at his modest lodgings arrived cards, notes, bidding to ceremonies greater and less. One or two of these summonses bore names which might have stirred envy in the sons of fashion. Solus feci. He allowed himself a little pride. His doing, it was true, had as yet been nothing much to the eye of the world, but he had made friends under circumstances not very favourable, friends among the intelligent and the powerful. That gift, it seemed, was his, if no other, the ability to make himself liked and respected. He, by law the son of nobody, had begun to approve himself true son of the father he loved and honoured. His habits were vigorous. Rising very early, he walked across the park and had a swim in the Serpentine. The hours of the solid day he spent for the most part in study at the British Museum. Then, if he had no engagement, he generally got by train well out of town and walked in sweet air until nightfall, or if the weather were bad, he granted himself the luxury of horse hire, and rode, teeth set against wind and rain. This earned him sleep, his daily prayer to the gods. At the date appointed, he went in search of Mrs. Borisoff, who welcomed him cordially. Her first inquiry was whether he had got the castle. "I have got it," Piers replied, and entered into particulars. They talked about it like children anticipating a holiday. Mrs. Borisoff then questioned him about his doings since he had been in England. On his mentioning a certain great lady, a Russian, with whom he was to dine next week, his friend replied with a laugh, which she refused to explain. "When can you spend an evening here? I don't mean a dinner. I'll give you something to eat, but it doesn't count. You come to talk, as I know you can, though you didn't let me suspect it at Petersburg. I shall have one or two others, old chums, not respectable people. Name your own day." When the evening came, Piers entered Mrs. Borisoff's drawing-room with trepidation. He glanced at the guest who had already arrived, a lady unknown to him, and when again the door opened, he looked, trembling. His fearful hope ended only in a headache, but he talked, as was expected of him, and the hostess smiled approval. "These friends of yours," he said aside to her before leaving, "are nice people to know, but—" and he broke off, meeting her eyes. "I don't understand," said his hostess with a perplexed look. "Then I daren't try to make you." A few days after, at the great house of the great Russian lady, he ascended the stairs without a tremor, and glanced round the room with indifference. No one would be there whom he could not face calmly. Brilliant women awed him a little at first, but it was not until afterwards, in the broken night following such occasions as this, that they had power over his imagination. Then he saw them, drawn upon darkness, their beauty without that halo of worldly grandeur which would not allow him to forget the gulf between them. The hostess herself shone by quality of intellect rather than by charm of feature. She greeted him with subtlest flattery, a word or two of simple friendliness in her own language, and was presenting him to her husband, when from the doorway sounded a name which made Otway's heart leap and left him tongue-tied. "Mrs. Borisoff and Miss Derwent." He turned, but with eyes downcast. For a moment he durst not raise them. He moved insensibly a few steps backward, shadowed himself behind two men who were conversing together, and at length he looked, with thrill of marvelling and rapture, with chill of self-abasement. When, years ago, he saw Irene in the dress of ceremony, she seemed to him peerlessly radiant, but it was the beauty and dignity of one still girlish. What he now beheld was the exquisite fulfilment of that bright promise. He had not erred in worship. She who had ever been to him the light of life, the beacon of his passionate soul, shone before him supreme among women. What head so noble in its unconscious royalty, what form so faultless in its mould and bearing? He heard her speak, the graceful nothings of introduction and recognition. It was Irene's voice, toned to a fuller music. Then her face dazzled and grew distant. He turned away to command himself. Mrs. Borisoff spoke beside him. "Have you no good evening for me?" "So this is what you meant." "You have a way of speaking in riddles." "And you a way of acting divinely." "Tell me." His voice sank, and his words were hurried. "May I go up to her as any acquaintance would? May I presume that she knows me?" "You mean Miss Derwent? But why not? I don't understand you." "Oh, no, I forget. It seems to you absurd. Oh, of course, she wrote and introduced me to you." "You are amusing, which is more than can be said of everyone." She bent her head and turned to speak with someone else. Piers, with what courage he knew not, stepped across the carpet to where Miss Derwent was sitting. She saw his approach, and held her hand to him as if they had met only the other day. That her complexion was a little warmer than its wont, Piers had no power of perceiving. He saw only her eyes, soft shining as they rose to his, in their depths an infinite gentleness. "Oh, how glad I am that you got my letter just before leaving Petersburg." "How kind of you to introduce me to Mrs. Borisoff." "I thought you would soon be friends." It was all they could say. At this moment the host murmured his request that Otway would take down Mrs. Borisoff. The hostess led up someone to be introduced to Miss Derwent, and then the procession began. Piers was both disappointed and relieved. To have felt the touch upon his arm of Irene's hand would have been a delight unutterable, yet to desire it was presumption. He was not worthy of that companionship. It would have been unjust to Irene to oblige her to sit by him through the dinner, with the inevitable thoughts rising in her mind. Better to see her from a distance, though it was hard when she smiled at the distinguished and clever-looking man who talked and talked. It cost him at first no small effort to pay becoming attention to Mrs. Borisoff. The lady, on his other hand, a brilliant beauty, moved him to a feeling almost hostile, he knew not why. But as the dinner progressed, as the kindly vintage circled in his blood, he felt the stirrings of a deep joy. By his own effort he had won reception into Irene's world. It was something. It was much, remembering all that had gone before. He spoke softly to his partner. "I'm going to drink a silent health, that of my friend Korolovich. To him I owe everything." "Oh, I don't believe that, but I will drink it too. I was speaking of him to Miss Derwent. She wants to know all about the Dukhobortsi. Instruct her afterwards if you get a chance. Do you think her altered?" "No, yes." "By the by, how long is it really since you first knew her?" 8 years. Just 8 years." "You speak as if it were 80. Why, so it seems when I look back. I was a boy, and had the strangest notions of the world."
"You shall tell me all about that some day," said Mrs. Borisoff, glancing at him. "At the castle, perhaps?"
"Oh, yes, at the castle."
When the company divided, and Piers had watched Irene pass out of sight, he sat down with a tired indifference, but his host drew him into conversation on Russian subjects, and, as happened before now in gatherings of this kind, Otway presently found himself amid attentive listeners, whilst he talked of things that interested him. At such moments he had an irreflective courage, which prompted him to utter what he thought without regard to anything but the common civilities of life. His opinions might excite surprise, but they did not give offence, for they seemed impersonal, the natural outcome of honest and capable observation, with never a touch of national prejudice or individual conceit. It was well, perhaps, for the young man's natural modesty,
that he did not hear certain remarks afterwards exchanged between the more intelligent of his hearers. When they passed to the drawing-room, the piano was sounding there. It stopped, and the player rose and moved away, but not before Piers had seen that it was Irene. He felt robbed of a delight. Oh, to hear Irene play! Better was in store for him. With a boldness natural to the hour, he drew nearer, watching his opportunity. The chair by Irene's side became vacant. He stepped forward and was met with a frank countenance, which invited him to take the coveted place. Miss Derwent spoke at once of her interest in the Russian sectaries with whom she had heard Otway was well acquainted, the people called Dukhobortsi, who held the carrying of arms a sin, and suffered persecution because of their conscientious refusal to perform military service. Piers spoke with enthusiasm of these people. They uphold the ideal above all necessary to our time. We ought to be rapidly outgrowing warfare. Isn't that the obvious next step in civilization? It seems a commonplace that everyone should look to that end and strive for it. Yet we're going back. There's a military reaction. Fighting is glorified by everyone who has a loud voice, and in no country more than in England. I wish you could hear a Russian friend of mine speak about it, a rich man who has just given up everything to join the Dukhobortsi. I never knew before what religious passion meant, and it seems to me that this is the world's only hope. Peace made religion. The forms don't matter. Only let the supreme end be peace. It is what people have talked so much about, the religion of the future. His tones moved the listener, as appeared in her look and attitude. Surely all the best in every country lean to it, she said. Of course, that's our hope. But at the same time, the pitiful thing, for the best hold back, keep silence, as if their quiet contempt could prevail against this activity of the reckless and foolish. One can't make a religion, said Irene sadly. It is just this religious spirit which has decayed throughout our world. Christianity turns to ritualism, and science, we were told, you know, that science would be religion enough. There's the pity, the failure of science as a civilizing force. I know, added Piers quickly, that there are men whose spirit, whose work, doesn't share in that failure. They are the men, the very few, who are above self-interest. But science, on the whole, has come to mean money-making and weapon-making. It leads the international struggle. It is judged by its value to the capitalist and soldier. Isn't this perhaps a stage of evolution that the world must live through, to its extreme results? Very likely. The signs are bad enough. You haven't yourself that enthusiastic hope? I try to hope, said Piers in a low, unsteady voice, his eyes falling timidly before her glance. But what you said is so true. One can't create the spirit of religion. If one hasn't it— He broke off and added with a smile, I think I have a certain amount of enthusiasm, but when one has seen a good deal of the world it is so very easy to feel discouraged. Think how much sheer barbarism there is around us, from the brutal savage of the gutter to the cunning savage of the stock exchange. Irene had a gleam in her eyes. She nodded appreciation. If, he went on vigorously, if one could make the multitude really understand to the point of action, how enormously its interest is peace. More hope that way, I'm afraid, said Irene, than through idealisms. Yes. If it comes at all, it'll be by the way of self-interest. And really it looks as if the military tyrants might overreach themselves here and there. Italy, for instance. Think of Italy, crushed and cursed by a blood tax that the people themselves see to be futile. one enters into the spirit of the men who freed Italy from foreigners. It was glorious, but how much more glorious to excite a rebellion there against her own rulers. Shouldn't you enjoy doing that? At times there is no subtler compliment to a woman than to address her as if she were a man. It must be done involuntarily, as was the case with this utterance of Otway's. Irene rewarded him with a look such as he had never had from her, the look of rejoicing comradeship. "Indeed I should. Italy is becoming a misery to those who love her. Is no plot going on? Couldn't one start a conspiracy against that infamous misgovernment?" "There's an arch plotter at work. His name is Hunger. Let us be glad that Italy can't enrich herself by manufactures. Who knows? The revolution against militarism may begin there, as that against feudalism did in France. Talk of enthusiasm! How should we feel if we read in the paper some morning that the Italian people had formed into an army of peace, refusing to pay another centesimo for warfare? The next boat for Calais, the next train for Rome. Their eyes met, interchanging gleams of laughter. "Oh, but the crowd, sighed Piers. "What is bad enough to say of it? Who shall draw its picture with long enough ears?" "It has another aspect, you know." "Oh, it has. At its best a smiling simpleton, at its worst a murderous maniac." "You're not exactly a socialist," remarked Irene, with that smile which, linking past and present, blended in Otway's heart old love and new, her smile of friendly irony. "Socialism? I seldom think of it, which means that I have no faith in it." "When we came in, you were playing." "I miss the connection," said Irene, with a puzzled air. "Oh, forgive me. I am fond of music, and it has been in my mind all the time, the hope that you would play again." "Oh, that was merely the slow music, as one might say, of the drawing-room mysteries, an obligato in the after-dinner harmony. I play only to amuse myself, or when it's a painful duty." Piers was warned by his tactful conscience that he had held Miss Derwent quite long enough in talk. A movement in their neighbourhood gave miserable opportunity. He resigned his seat to another expectant, and did his best to converse with someone else. Her voice went with him as he walked homeward across the park, under a fleecy sky silvered with moonlight, the voice which now and again brought back so vividly their first meeting at Ewell. He lived through it all again, the tremors, the wild hopes, the black despair of 8 years ago. How she encountered him on the stairs, talked of his long hours of study, and prophesied, with that indescribable blending of gravity and jest still her characteristic, that he would come to grief over his examination. Irene, did she dream what was in his mind and heart? The long, long love, his very life through all labours and cares and casualties. Did she suspect it? Imagine it? If she had received his foolish verses, he grew hot to think of them, there must have been at least a moment when she knew that he worshipped her, and does such knowledge ever fade from a woman's memory? Irene, was she brought nearer to him by her own experience of heart trouble? That she had suffered he could not doubt. Impossible for her to have given her consent to marriage unless she believed herself in love with the man who wooed her. It could have been no trifling episode in her life, whatever the story. Irene was not of the women who yield their hands in jest, in pique, in light-hearted ignorance. The change visible in her was more, he fancied, than could be due to the mere lapse of time. During her silences, she had the look of one familiar with mental conflict, perhaps of one whose pride had suffered an injury. The one or two glances which he ventured while she was talking with the man who succeeded to his place beside her perceived a graver countenance, a reserve such as she had not used with him. and of this insubstantial solace he made a sort of hope which winged the sleepless hours till daybreak. He had permission to call upon Mrs. Borisoff at times alien to polite routine. Thus, when nearly a week had passed, he sought her company at midday, and found her idling over a book, her seat by a window which viewed the Thames and the broad embankment with its plane trees, and London beyond the water, picturesque in squalid hugeness through summer haze and the sagging smoke of chimneys numberless. She gave a languid hand, pointed to a chair, gazed at him with embarrassing fixity. "I don't know about the castle," were her first words. "Perhaps I shall give it up." "You are not serious?" Piers spoke and looked in dismay, and still she kept her heavy eyes upon him. "What does it matter to you?" she said carelessly. "Oh, I counted on showing you the Dales." Mrs. Borisoff nodded twice or thrice, and laughed, then pointed to the prospect through the window. "This is more interesting. Imagine historians living 1,000 years hence. What would they give to see what we see now?" "Oh, one often has that thought. It's about the best way of making ordinary life endurable." They watched the steamers and barges, silent for a minute or two. "So you had rather I didn't give up the castle?" "I should be horribly disappointed." "Yes, no doubt you would. Why did you come to see me to-day?" No. The real reason." "I wanted to talk about Miss Derwent," Piers answered, bracing himself to frankness. Mrs. Borisoff's lips contracted in something which was not quite a smile, but which became a smile before she spoke. "If you hadn't told the truth, Mr. Otway, I would have sent you about your business. Well, talk of her. I'm ready." "Oh, but certainly not if it wearies you." "Talk. "I'll begin with a question. Does Miss Derwent go much into society?" "No, not very much. And it's only the last few months that she's been seen at all in London. I mean, since the affair that people talked about." "Did they talk disagreeably?" "Oh, gossip, chatter, half malicious without malicious intention. Don't you know the way of the sweet creatures? I would tell you more if I could. The simple truth is that Irene has never spoken to me about it. Never once. When it happened, she came suddenly to Paris, to a hotel, and from there wrote me a letter, just saying that her marriage was off. No word of explanation. Of course I fetched her at once to my house, and from that moment to this I have not heard one reference from her to the matter. You would like to know something about the hero? He has been away a good deal, building up the empire, as they say, which means, of course, looking after his own and other people's dividends." "Oh, thank you. Now let us talk about the castle." But Mrs. Borisoff was not in a good humour to-day, and Piers very soon took his leave. Her hand felt rather hot. He noticed this particularly as she let it lie in his longer than usual, part of her absent-mindedness. Piers had often resented as a weakness his susceptibility to the influence of others' moods. He did so to-day, when, having gone to Mrs. Borisoff in an unusually cheerful frame of mind, he came away languid and despondent. But his scheme of life permitted no such idle brooding as used to waste his days. Self-discipline sent him to his work as usual through the afternoon, and in the evening he walked 10 miles. The weather was brilliant. As he stood far away in rural stillness, watching a noble sunset, he repeated to himself words which had of late become his motto. "Enjoy now. This moment will never come again." But the intellectual resolve was one thing, the moral aptitude another. He did not enjoy. How many hours in all his life had brought him real enjoyment? Idle to repeat and repeat that life was the passing minute which must be seized, made the most of. He could not live in the present. Life was to him forever a thing postponed. I will live. I will enjoy. Some day. As likely as not, that day would never dawn. Was it true, as admonishing reason sometimes whispered, that happiness cometh not by observation, that the only true content is in the moments which we pass without self-consciousness? Is all attainment followed by disillusion? A man aware of his health is on the verge of malady. Were he to possess his desire, to exclaim, "I am happy," would the fates chastise his presumption? That way lay asceticism, which his soul abhorred. On rather following the great illusion, if this it were, the crown of life, philosophize as he might, that word still had its meaning, still its inspiration. Let the present pass untasted. He preferred his dream of a day to come. Next morning, very unexpectedly, he received a note from Mrs. Borisoff, inviting him to dine with her a few days hence. About her company she said nothing, and Piers went, uncertain whether it was a dinner tete-a-tete or with other guests. When he entered the room, the first face he beheld was Irene's. It was a very small party, and the hostess wore her gayest countenance. A delightful evening from the social point of view, for Piers Otway, a time of self-forgetfulness in the pleasures of sight and hearing. He could have little private talk with Irene. She did not talk much with anyone. But he saw her. He heard her voice. He lived in the glory of her presence. Moreover, she consented to play. Of her skill as a pianist, Otway could not judge. What he heard was music. Music absolute, the very music of the spheres. When it ceased, Mrs. Borisoff chanced to look at him. He was startlingly pale, his eyes wide as if in vision more than mortal. "I leave town to-morrow," said his hostess, as he took leave. "Some friends are going with me. You shall hear how we get on at the castle." Perhaps her look was meant to supplement this bare news. It seemed to offer reassurance. Did she understand his look of entreaty in reply? Music breathed about him in the lonely hours. It exalted his passion, lulled the pains of desire, held the flesh subservient to spirit. What is love, says the physiologist, but ravening sex? If so, in Piers Otway's breast the primal instinct had undergone strange transformation. How wrought, he asked himself, to what destiny did it correspond, this winged love soaring into the infinite, this rapture of devotion, this utter humbling of self, this ardour of the poet's soul, singing a fellow creature to the heaven of heavens? By what alchemy comes it forth from blood and tissue? Nature has no need of such lyric life. Her purpose is well achieved by humbler instrumentality. Romantic lovers are not the ancestry of noblest lines. And if, as might well be, his love were defeated and fruitless, what end in the vast maze of things would his anguish serve? End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Crown of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Crown of Life by George Gissing, Chapter 34. After his day's work, he had spent an hour among the pictures at Burlington House. He was lingering before an exquisite landscape, unwilling to change this atmosphere of calm for the roaring street, when a voice timidly addressed him. "Mr. Otway." How altered! The face was much, much older, and in some indeterminable way had lost its finer suggestions. At her best, Olga Hannaford had a distinction of feature, a singularity of emotional expression, which made her beautiful. In Olga Florio, the lines of visage were far less subtle, and classed her under an inferior type. Transition from maidenhood to what is called the matronly had been too rapid. It was emphasized by her costume, which cried aloud in its excess of modish splendour. "How glad I am to see you again," she sighed tremorously, pressing his hand with fervour, and gazing at him with furtive directness. "Are you living in England now?" Piers gave an account of himself. He was a little embarrassed, but quite unagitated. A sense of pity averted his eyes after the first wondering look. "Will you, may I venture, can you spare the time to come and have tea with me? My carriage is waiting, and I'm quite alone. I only looked in for a few minutes to rest my mind after a lunch with such tiresome people." His impulse was to refuse, at all cost to refuse. The voice, the glance, the phrases jarred upon him, shocked him. Already he had begun, "I'm afraid," when a hurried, vehement whisper broke upon his excuse. "Don't be unkind to me. I beg you to come. I entreat you." "I will come with pleasure," he said in a loud voice of ordinary civility. At once she turned, and he followed. Without speaking, they descended the great staircase. A brougham drove up, and they rolled away westward. Never had Piers felt such thorough moral discomfort. The heavily perfumed air of the carriage depressed and all but nauseated him. The inevitable touch of Olga's garments made him shrink. She had begun to talk, and talked incessantly throughout the homeward drive, not much of herself or of him, but about the pleasures and excitements of the idle, busy world. It was meant, he supposed, to convey to him an idea of her prosperous and fashionable life. Her husband, she let fall, was for the moment in Italy. Affairs of importance sometimes required his presence there, but they both preferred England. The intellectual atmosphere of London. Where else could one live on so high a level? The carriage stopped in a street beyond Edgware Road, at a house of more modest appearance than Otway had looked for. Just as they alighted, a nursemaid with a perambulator was approaching the door. Piers caught sight of a very pale little face shadowed by the hood, but his companion, without heeding, ran up the steps and knocked violently. They entered. Still the oppressive atmosphere of perfumes. Left for a few minutes in a little drawing-room or boudoir, Piers stood marvelling at the ingenuity which had packed so much furniture and bric-a-brac, so many pictures and so much drapery into so small a space. He longed to throw open the window. He could not sit still in this odour-laden hothouse where the very flowers were burdensome by excess. When Olga reappeared, she was gorgeous in flowing tea-gown. Her tawny hair hung low in artful profusion. Her neck and arms were bare, her feet brilliantly slippered. "Oh, how good it is to sit down and talk to you once more. Do you like my room?" "You have made yourself very comfortable," replied Otway, striking a note as much as possible in contrast to that of his hostess. "Some of these drawings are your own work, no doubt." "Oh, yes, some of them," she answered languidly. "Do you remember that pastel? Oh, surely you do, from the old days at Ewell." "Of course. And that is a portrait of your husband?" he added, indicating a head on a little easel. "Yes, idealised." She laughed and put the subject away. Then tea was brought in, and after pouring it, Olga grew silent. Resolute to talk, Piers had the utmost difficulty in finding topics, but he kept up an everyday sort of chat, postponing as long as possible the conversation foreboded by his companion's face. When he was weary, Olga's opportunity came. "There is something I must say to you." Her arms hung lax, her head drooped forward. She looked at him from under her brows. "I have suffered so much. Oh, I have suffered. I've longed for this moment. Will you say that you forgive me?" "My dear Mrs. Florio," Piers began with good-natured expostulation, a sort of forced bluffness, but she would not hear him. Not that name. Not from you. There's no harm. You can't misunderstand me, such old friends as we are. I want you to call me by my own name, and to make me feel that we are friends still, that you can really forgive me." "There's nothing in the world to forgive," he insisted in the same tone. "Of course we are friends. How could we be anything else?" "Oh, I behaved infamously to you. I can't think how I had the heart to do it." Piers was tortured with nervousness. Had her voice and manner declared insincerity or posing, anything of that kind, he would have found the situation much more endurable. But Olga had tears in her eyes, and not the tears of an actress. Her tones had recovered something of their old quality, and reminded him painfully of the time when Mrs. Hannaford was dying. She held a hand to him. Her pale face besought his compassion. "Oh, come now, let us talk in the old way, as you wish," he said, just pressing her fingers. "Of course I felt it, but then I was myself altogether to blame. I importuned you for what you couldn't give. Remembering that, wasn't your action the most sensible, and really the kindest?" "Oh, I don't know," Olga murmured in a voice just audible. "Oh, of course it was. There now, we've done with all that. Tell me more about your life this last year or two. You're such a brilliant person. I felt rather overcome." "Oh, nonsense." But Olga brightened a little. "What of your own brilliancy? I read somewhere that you're a famous man in Russia." Piers laughed, spontaneously this time, and, finding it a way of escape, gossiped about his own achievements with mirthful exaggeration. "Do you see the Derwents?" Mrs. Florio asked of a sudden, with a sidelong look. So vexed was Otway at the embarrassment he could not wholly hide, and which delayed his answer, that he spoke the truth with excessive bluntness. "I have met Miss Derwent in society." "I don't often see them," said Olga in a tone of weariness. "I suppose we belong to different worlds." At the earliest possible moment, Piers rose with decision. He felt that he had not pleased Mrs. Florio, that perhaps he had offended her, and in leaving her he tried to atone for involuntary unkindness. "Oh, but we shall see each other again, of course," she exclaimed, retaining his hand. "You will come again soon?" "Oh, certainly I will." "And your address? Let me have your address." He breathed deeply in the open air. Glancing back at the house when he had crossed the street, he saw a white hand waved to him at a window. It hurried his step. On the following day, Mrs. Florio visited her friend Miss Bonnicastle, who had some time since exchanged the old quarters in Great Portland Street for a house in Pimlico, where there was a larger studio, or workshop, as she preferred to call it, hung about with her own and other people's designs. The artist of the poster was full as ever of vitality and of good nature, but her humour had not quite the old spice. A stickler for decorum would have said that she was decidedly improved, that she had grown more womanly, and something of this change appeared also in her work, which tended now to the graceful rather than the grotesque. She received her fashionable visitant with off-hand friendliness, not altogether with cordiality. "Oh, I've something to show you. Do you know that name?" Olga took a business card and read upon it, "Alexander Otway, dramatic and musical agent." "It's his brother," she said, in a voice of quiet surprise. "I thought so. The man called yesterday. Wants a fetching thing to boom an Irish girl at the halls. There's her photo." It represented a piquant person in short skirts, a face neither very pretty nor very young, but likely to be deemed attractive by the public in question. They amused themselves over it for a moment. "He used to be a journalist," said Olga. "Does he seem to be doing well?" couldn't say. Great talker and a furious jingo.
A jingo?
This woman is to sing a song of his composition, all about the Empire, not the Hall, the British. Glorifies the flag, that blessed rag, a rhyme I suggested to him and asked him to pay me for it. It's a taking tune, and we shall have it everywhere, no doubt. He sang a verse. I wish you could have heard him. A queer fish.
Olga walked about, seeming to inspect the pictures, but in reality much occupied with her thoughts. "Well," she said presently, "I only looked in, dear, to say how do you do." Miss Bonnycastle was drawing. She turned as if to shake hands, but looked her friend in the face with a peculiar expression, far more earnest than was commonly seen in her. "You called on Kite yesterday morning." Olga, with slight confusion, admitted that she had been to see the artist. For some weeks Kite had suffered from an ailment which confined him to the house. He could not walk, and indeed could do nothing but lie and read, or talk of what he would do when he recovered his health. Cheap claret having lost its inspiring force, the poor fellow had turned to more potent beverages, and would ere now have sunk into inscrutable deeps but for Miss Bonnycastle, who interested herself in his welfare. Olga, after losing sight of him for nearly 2 years, by chance discovered his whereabouts and his circumstances, and twice in the past week had paid him a visit. "I wanted to tell you," pursued Miss Bonnycastle in a steady, matter-of-fact voice, "that he's going to have a room in this house and be looked after." "Indeed?" There was a touch of malice in Olga's surprise. She held herself rather stiffly. "It's just as well to be straightforward," continued the other. "I should like to say that it'll be very much better if you don't come to see him at all." Olga was now very dignified indeed. "Oh, pray say no more. I quite understand. Quite." "I shouldn't have said it at all," rejoined Miss Bonnycastle, "if I could have trusted your discretion. The fact is, I found I couldn't." "Really," exclaimed Olga, red with anger, "you might spare me insults." "Oh, come, come. We're not going to fly at each other, Olga. I intended no insult. But whilst we're about it, do take advice from one who means it well. Sentiment is all right, but sentimentality is all wrong. Do get rid of it, there's a good girl. You're meant for something better." Olga made a great sweep of the floor with her skirts, and vanished in a whirl of perfume. She drove straight to the address which she had seen on Alexander Otway's card. It was in a decently sordid street south of the river. In a window on the ground floor hung an announcement of Alexander's name and business. As Olga stood at the door, there came out, showily dressed for walking, a person in whom she at once recognised the original of the portrait at Miss Bonnycastle's. It was no other than Mrs. Otway, the biddy whose simple singing had so pleased her brother-in-law years ago. "Is it the agent you want to see?" she asked in her tongue of County Wexford. "The door to the right." Alexander jumped up, all smiles at the sight of so grand a lady. He had grown very obese, and very red about the neck. His linen might have been considerably cleaner, and his coat better brushed. But he seemed in excellent spirits, and glowed when his visitor began by saying that she wished to speak in confidence of a delicate matter. "Mr. Otway, you have an elder brother, his name Daniel?" The listener's countenance fell. "Madam, I am sorry to say I have." "He has written to me more than once a begging letter. My name doesn't matter. I'll only say now that he used to know me slightly long ago. I wish to ask you whether he really is in want." Alexander hesitated, with much screwing of the features. "Well, he may be, now and then," was his reply at length.
I have helped him, but to tell the truth, it's not much good. So far as I know, he has no regular supplies, but it's his own fault." "Exactly." Olga evidently approached a point still more delicate. "I presume he has worn out the patience of both brothers?" "Ah," the agent shook his head. "I'm sorry to say that the other's patience— I see you know something of our family circumstances— never allowed itself to be tried. He's very well off, I believe, but he'll do nothing for poor Dan, and never would. I'm bound to admit Dan has his faults, but still—" His brows expressed sorrow rather than anger on the subject of his hard-fisted relative. "Do you happen to know anything," pursued Olga, lowering her voice, "of a transaction about certain letters which were given up by Daniel Otway?" "Why, yes, I've heard something about that affair." "Those letters, I always understood, were purchased from him at a considerable price." "That's true," replied Alexander, smiling familiarly as he leaned across the table. "But the considerable price was never paid. Not 1 penny of it." Olga's face changed. She had a wondering, lost, pained look. "Mr. Otway, are you sure of that?" "Well, pretty sure. Dan has talked of it more than once, and I don't think he could talk as he does if there wasn't a real grievance. I'm very much afraid he was cheated. Perhaps I oughtn't to use that word. I daresay Dan had no right to ask for money for the letters at all. But there was a bargain, and I'm afraid it wasn't honourably kept on the other side." Olga reflected for a moment and rose, saying that she was obliged, that this ended her business. Alexander's curiosity sought to prolong the conversation, but in vain. He then threw out a word concerning his professional interests. Would the lady permit him to bespeak her countenance for a new singer, an Irish girl of great talent, who would be coming out very shortly? "She has a magnificent song, madam, the very spirit of patriotism, stirring, stirring. Let me offer you one of her photos. Miss Ennis Corthey. You'll soon see the announcements." Olga drove away in a troubled dream. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Crown of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Crown of Life by George Gissing. Chapter 35. "The 13th will suit admirably," wrote Helen Borisoff. "That morning my guests leave, and we shall be quiet, except for the popping of guns round about, which reminds me that my big healthy Englishman of a cousin, him you met in town, will be down here to slaughter little birds in aristocratic company, and may most likely look in to tell us of his bags. I'll meet you at the station." So Irene, alone, journeyed from King's Cross into the North Riding. At evening, the sun golden amid long, lazy clouds that had spent their showers, she saw wide Wensleydale, its closing hills higher to north and south as the train drew onward, green slopes of meadow and woodland rising to the beat and the heather. At a village station appeared the welcoming face of her friend Helen. A countryman with his homely gig drove them up the hillside, the sweet air singing about them from moorland heights, the long dales spreading in grander prospect as they ascended, and then hidden as they dropped into a wooded glen, where the horse splashed through a broad beck and the wheels jolted over boulders of limestone. Out again into the sunset, and at a turn of the climbing road stood up before them the grey old castle, in its shadow the church and the hamlet, and all around the glory of rolling hills. Of the 4 great towers, one lay a shattered ruin, one only remained habitable. Above the rooms occupied by Mrs. Borisoff and her guests was that which had imprisoned the Queen of Scots, a chamber of bare stone, with high embrasure narrowing to the slit of a window which admitted daylight, and, if one climbed the sill, gave a glimpse of far mountains. Down below, deep under the roots of the tower, was the castle's dungeon, black and deadly. Early on the morrow Helen led her friend to see these things. Then they climbed to the battlements, where the sun shone hot, and Helen pointed out the features of the vast landscape, naming heights and little dales which pour their tributaries into the Ure, and villages lying amid the rich pasture. "And yonder is Hawes," said Irene, pointing to the head of the dale. "Yes, too far to see." They did not exchange a look. Irene spoke at once of something else. There came to lunch Mrs. Borisoff's cousin, a grouse guest at a house some miles away. He arrived on horseback, and his approach was watched with interest by 2 pairs of eyes from the castle windows. Mr. March looked well in the saddle, for he was a strong, comely man of about 30, who lived mostly under the open sky. Irene had met him only once, and that in a drawing-room. She saw him now to greater advantage, heard him talk freely of things he understood and enjoyed, and on the whole did not dislike him. With Helen he was a favourite. She affected to make fun of him, but had confessed to Irene that she respected him more than any other of her county family kinsfolk. As he talked of his 2 days' shooting, he seemed to become aware that Miss Derwent had no profound interest in this subject, and there fell from him an unexpected apology. "Of course it isn't a very noble kind of sport," he said with a laugh. "One is invited, one takes it in the course of things. I prefer the big game, where there's a chance of having to shoot for your life." "I suppose one must shoot something," remarked Irene, as if musing a commonplace. March took it with good nature, like a man who cannot remember whether that point of view ever occurred to him, but who is quite willing to think about it. Indeed, he seemed more than willing to give attention to anything Miss Derwent chose to say. Something of this inclination had appeared even at their first meeting, and to-day it was more marked. He showed reluctance when the hour obliged him to remount his horse. Mrs. Borisoff's hope that she might see him again before he left this part of the country received a prompt and cheerful reply. Later, that afternoon, the 2 friends climbed the great hillside above the castle, and rambled far over the moorland to a windy height where they looked into deep, wild Swaledale. Their talk was only of the scenes around them, until on their way back they approached a line of 3-walled shelters, built of rough stone, about the height of a man. In reply to Irene's question, Helen explained the use of these structures. She did so in an off-hand way with the proper terms, and would have passed on, but Irene stood gazing. "What, they lie in ambush here, whilst the men drive the birds towards them to be shot?" "It's sport," rejoined the other indifferently. "I see. And here are the old cartridges." A heap of them lay close by amid the ling. "I don't wonder that Mr. March seemed a little ashamed of himself." "Oh, but surely you knew all about this sort of thing?" said Mrs. Borisoff with a little laugh of impatience. "No, I didn't." She had picked up one of the cartridge cases, and after examining it, her eyes wandered about the vast rolling moor. The wind sang low, the clouds sailed across the mighty dome of heaven. Not a human dwelling was visible, and not a sound broke upon nature's infinite calm. "It amazes me," Irene continued, subduing her voice. "Incredible that men can come up here just to bang guns and see beautiful birds fall dead. One would think that what they saw here would stop their hands, that this silence would fill their minds and hearts, and make it impossible." Her voice had never trembled with such emotion in Helen's hearing. It was not Irene's habit to speak in this way. She had the native reticence of English women, preferring to keep silence when she felt strongly, or to disguise her feeling with irony and jest. But the hour and the place overcame her. A noble passion shone in her clear eyes and thrilled in her utterance. "What barbarians!" "Oh, you know they are nothing of the kind," objected Helen. "At least, not all of them." "Mr. March, you called him yourself a fine barbarian, quoting from Matthew Arnold. I never before understood how true that description was." "I assure you it doesn't apply to him, whatever I may have said in joke. This shooting is the tradition of a certain class. It's one of the ways in which great, strong men get their necessary exercise. Some of them feel at moments just as you do, I've no doubt. But there they are, a lot of them together, and a man can't make himself ridiculous, you know." "You're not like yourself in this, Helen," said Irene. "You're not speaking as you think. Another time you'll confess it's abominable savagery, with not one good word to be said for it, and more contemptible than I ever suspected. I'm so glad I've seen this. It helps to clear my thoughts about things in general." She flung away the little yellow cylinder, flung it far from her with disgust, and as if to forget it, plucked as she walked on a spray of heath which glowed with its purple bells among the redder ling. Helen's countenance was shadowed. She spoke no more for several minutes. When 2 days had passed, March again came riding up to the castle, and lunched with the ladies. Irene was secretly vexed. At breakfast she had suggested a whole day's excursion, which her friend persuaded her to postpone. The reason must have been Helen's private knowledge that Mr. March was coming. In consequence, the lunch fell short of perfect cheerfulness. For reasons of her own, Irene was just a little formal in her behaviour to the guest. She did not talk so well as usual, and bore herself as a girl must, who wishes, without unpleasantness, to check a man's significant approaches. In the hot afternoon, chairs were taken out into the shadow of the castle walls, and there the three sat conversing. Someone drew near, a man, whom the careless glance of Helen's cousin took for a casual tourist about to view the ruins. Helen herself, and in the same moment Irene, recognized Piers Otway. It seemed as though Mrs. Borisoff would not rise to welcome him. Her smile was dubious, half surprised. She cast a glance at Irene, whose face was set in the austerest self-control, and thereupon not only stood up, but stepped forward with cordial greeting. "So you have really come. Delighted to see you. Are you walking, as you said?" "Too hot," Piers replied with a laugh. "I spent yesterday at York, and came on in a cowardly way by train." He was shaking hands with Irene, who dropped a word or two of mere courtesy. In introducing him to March, Mrs. Borisoff said, "An old friend of ours," which caused her stalwart cousin to survey the dark, slimly built man very attentively. "We'll get you a chair, Mr. Otway." "Oh, no. Let me sit or lie here on the grass. It's all I feel fit for after the climb." He threw himself down, nearer to Helen than to her friend, and the talk became livelier than before his arrival. Irene emerged from the taciturnity into which she had more and more withdrawn, and March, not an unobservant man, evidently noted this, and reflected upon it. He had at first regarded the newcomer with a civil aloofness, as not one of his world. Presently he seemed to ask himself to what world the singular being might belong. A man who knew how to behave himself, and whose talk implied more than common savoir-vivre, yet who differed in such noticeable points from an Englishman of the leisured class. Helen was in a mischievous mood. She broached the subject of grouse, addressing to Otway an ambiguous remark, which led March to ask, with veiled surprise, whether he was a sportsman. "Mr. Otway's taste is for bigger game," she exclaimed, before Piers could reply. "He lives in hope of potting Russians on the Indian frontier." Well, I can sympathise with him in that, said the large-limbed man, puzzled but smiling. He'll probably have a chance before very long. No sooner had he spoken than a scarlet confusion glowed upon his face. In speculating about Otway, he had for the moment forgotten his cousin's name. "Oh, I beg your pardon, Helen. Oh, what an idiot I am. Oh, of course you were joking. Oh, don't apologise, Edward. Tell truth and shame. Your Russian relatives. I like you all the better for it." "Thank you," he answered. "After all, there's no harm in a little fighting. It's better to fight and have done with it, and keep on plotting between compliments. Nations are just like schoolboys, you know. There has to be a round now and then. It settles things, and it's good for the blood." Otway was biting a blade of grass. He smiled and said nothing. Mrs. Borisoff glanced from him to Irene, who also was smiling, but looked half vexed. "How can it be good, for health or anything else?" Miss Derwent asked suddenly, turning to the speaker. "Oh, we couldn't do without fighting. It's in human nature." "In uncivilized human nature, yes." "Oh, but really, you know," urged March with good-natured deference, "it wouldn't do to civilize away pluck, courage and heroism, whatever one likes to call it." "Oh, of course it wouldn't. But what has pluck or heroism to do with bloodshed? How can anyone imagine that courage is only shown in fighting? I don't happen to have been in a battle, but one knows very well how easy it must be for any coward or brute, excited to madness, to become what's called a hero. Heroism is noble courage in ordinary life. Are you serious in thinking that life offers no opportunities for it?" "Well, it's not quite the same thing." "Happily not. It's a vastly better thing. Every day some braver deed is done by plain men and women, yes, women, if you please, than was ever known on the battlefield. One only hears of them now and then, on the railway, on the sea, in the hospital, in burning houses, in accidents of road and street. Are there no opportunities for courage? In the commonest everyday home life, doesn't any man or woman have endless chances of being brave or a coward? And this is civilized courage, not the fury of a bull at a red rag." Piers Otway had ceased to nibble his blade of grass. His eyes were fixed on Irene. When she had made a sudden end of speaking, and when she smiled her apology for the fervour forbidden in polite converse, he still gazed at her, self-oblivious. Helen Borisoff watched him askance. "Let us go in and have some tea," she said, rising abruptly. Soon after, March said good-bye, a definite good-bye. He was going to another part of England. With all the grace of his caste, he withdrew from a circle in which, temptations notwithstanding, he had not felt quite at ease. Riding down the dale through a sunny shower, he was refreshed and himself again. "Where do you put up tonight?" asked Helen of Otway, turning to him when the other man had gone, with a brusque familiarity. "At the inn down in Redmire." "And what do you do tomorrow?" "Go to see the falls at Aysgarth, for one thing. There's been rain up on the hills. The river will be grand." "Oh, perhaps we shall be there." When Piers had left them, Helen said to her friend, "I wanted to ask him to stay and dine, but I didn't know whether you would like it." I'm not the hostess." "No, but you have humours, Irene. One has to be careful." Irene knitted her brows, and stood for a moment with face half averted. "If I cause this sort of embarrassment," she said frankly, "I think I oughtn't to stay." "Oh, it's easily put right, my dear girl. Answer me a simple question. If I lead Mr. Otway to suppose that his company for a few days is not disagreeable to us, shall I worry you or not?" "Not in the least," was the equally direct answer. "That's better. We've always got along so well, you know, that it's annoying to feel there's something not quite understood between us. Then I shall send a note down to the inn where he's staying to appoint a meeting at Aysgarth tomorrow. And I shall ask him to come for the rest of the day if he chooses. At nightfall the rain clouds spread from the hills of Westmoreland, and there were some hours of downpour. This did not look hopeful for the morrow, but on the other hand it promised a finer sight at the falls if by chance the weather grew tolerable. The sun rose amid dropping vapours, and at breakfast time had not yet conquered the day, but a steady brightening soon put an end to doubt. The friends prepared to set forth. As they were entering the carriage, there arrived the postman, with letters for both, which they read driving down to the Dale. One of Irene's correspondents was her brother, and the contents of Eustace's letter so astonished her that she sat for a time absorbed in thought. "Not bad news, I hope?" said Helen, who had glanced quickly over the few lines from her husband, now at Ostend. "No, but startling. You may as well read the letter." It was written in Eustace Derwent's best style, really a very good letter both as to composition and in the matter of feeling. After duly preparing his sister for what might come as a shock, he made known to her that he was about to marry Mrs. John Jacks, the widow of the late Member of Parliament. "I can quite imagine," he proceeded, "that this may trouble your mind by exciting unpleasant memories, and perhaps may make you apprehensive of disagreeable things in the future. Pray have no such uneasiness. Only this morning I had a long talk with Arnold Jacks, who was very friendly, and indeed could not have behaved better. He spoke of you, and quite in the proper way. I was to remember him very kindly to you if I thought the remembrance would not be unwelcome. As for my dear Marian, you will find her everything that a sister should be." Followed sundry details, and a promise of more information when they met again in town. "Describe her to me," said Helen, who had a slight acquaintance with Irene's brother. "One word does it. Irreproachable. A couple of years older than Eustace, I think. John Jacks was more than twice her age, so it's only fair. The dear boy will probably give up his profession and become an ornament of society, a model of all the proprieties. Wonderful I shan't realise it for a few days." As they drove on to the bridge at Aysgarth, Piers Otway stood there awaiting them. They exchanged few words. The picture before their eyes and the wild music that filled the air imposed silence. Headlong between its high banks plunged the swollen torrent, the roaring spate, brown from its washing of the peaty moorland and churned into flying flakes of foam. Over the worn ledges, and at other times a succession of little waterfalls, rolled in resistless fury a mighty cataract. At great rocks in mid-channel it leapt with surges like those of an angry sea. The spectacle was fascinating in its grandeur, appalling in its violence. With the broad leafage of the glen arched over it in warm, still sunshine, wondrously beautiful. They wandered some way by the river banks, and then drove to other spots of which Otway spoke, lunched at a village inn, and by 4 o'clock returned all together to the castle. After tea, Piers found himself alone with Irene. Mrs. Borisoff had left the room while he was speaking, and so silently that for a moment he was not aware of her withdrawal. Alone with Irene, for the first time since he had known her. Even at Ewell long ago they had never been together without companionship. There fell a silence. Piers could not lift his eyes to the face which had all day been before him, the face which seemed more than ever beautiful amid nature's beauties. He wished to thank her for the letter she had written to him in St. Petersburg, but was fearful of seeming to make too much of this mark of kindness. Irene herself resumed the conversation. "You will continue to write for the reviews, I hope?" "I shall try to," he answered softly. "Your Russian must be very idiomatic. I found it hard in places." Overcome with delight, he looked at her and bent towards her. "Mrs. Borisoff told me you'd learnt. I know what that means, learning Russian in England, out of books. I began to do it at Ewell. Do you remember?" "Oh, yes, I remember very well. Have you written anything besides these 2 articles? Written, yes, but not published. I've written all sorts of things. His voice shook. Even verse. He repented the word as soon as it was uttered, and again his eyes could not move towards hers. I know you have, said Irene, in the voice of one who smiles. I've never been sure that you knew it, that you received those verses. To tell you the truth, I didn't know how to acknowledge them. I never received the dedication of a poem before or since, and in my awkwardness I put off my thanks till it was too late to send them. But I remember the lines. I think they were beautiful. Shall you ever include them in a volume? I wrote no more. I'm no poet. Yet if you had given a word of praise— He laughed, as one does when emotion is too strong. I should have written on and on with glorious belief in myself. Perhaps it was well, then, that I said nothing. Poetry must come of itself, without praise, don't you think? Yes, I lived it, or tried to live it, instead of putting it into metre. That's exactly what I once heard my father say about himself, and he called it consuming his own smoke. Piers could not but join in her quiet laugh, yet he had never felt a moment less opportune for laughter. As if to prove that she purposely changed the note of their dialogue, Irene reached a volume from the table and said in the most matter-of-fact voice, "Here's a passage of Tolstoy that I can't make out. Be my professor, please. First of all, let me hear you read it aloud for the accent." The lesson continued till Helen entered the room again. Irene so willed it. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Crown of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Crown of Life by George Gissing, Chapter 36. She sat by her open window, which looked over the dale to the long high ridge of moors, softly drawn against a moonlit sky. Far below sounded the rushing Ure, and at moments there came upon the fitful breeze a deeper music, that of the falls at Aysgarth, miles away. It was an hour since she had bidden good night to Helen, and 2 hours or more since all else in the castle and in the cottages had been still and dark. She loved this profound quiet, this solitude guarded by the eternal powers of nature. She loved the memories and imaginings born upon the stillness of these grey old towers, the fortress of warrior lords, the prison of a queen, the royalist refuge, fallen now into such placid dreaminess of age. Into the dark chamber above, desolate, legend-haunted, perchance in some moment of the night there fell through the narrow window-niche a pale moonbeam, touching the floor, the walls of stone. Such light in gloom as may have touched the face of Mary herself, wakeful with her recollections and her fears. Musing it in her fancy, Irene thought of love and death. Had it come to her at length, that love which was so strange and distant, when in ignorance she believed it her companion? Verses in her mind, verses that would never be forgotten, however lightly she held them, sang and rang to a new melody. They were not poetry, said he who wrote them, yet they were truth, sweetly and nobly uttered. The false, the trivial, does not so cling to memory year after year. They had helped her to know him, these rhyming lines, or so she fancied. They shaped in her mind, slowly, insensibly, an image of the man, throughout the lapse of time when she neither saw him nor heard of him. Whether a true image, how should she assure herself? She only knew that no feature of it seemed alien when compared with the impression of those 2 last days. Yet the picture was an ideal, the very man she could honour, love, he and no other. Did she perilously deceive herself in thinking that this ideal and the man who spoke with her were one? It had grown without her knowledge, apart from her will, this conception of Piers Otway.
The first half-consciousness of such a thought came to her when she heard from Olga of those letters, obtained by him for a price, and given to the kinsfolk of the dead woman. An interested generosity? She had repelled the suggestion as unworthy, ignoble. Whether the giver was ever thanked, she did not know. Dr. Derwent kept cold silence on the subject after once mentioning it to her in formal words. Thanks undoubtedly were due to him. Tonight it pained her keenly to think that perhaps her father had said nothing. She began to study Russian, and in secret, her impulse dark or so obscurely hinted that it caused her no more than a moment's reverie. Looking back, she saw but one explanation of the energy, the zeal which had carried her through these labours. It shone clear on the day when a letter from Helen Borisoff told her that an article in a Russian review just published bore the name of Piers Otway. Thence onward she was frank with herself. She recognized the meaning of the intellectual process which had tended to harmonize her life with that she imagined for her ideal man. There came a prompting of emotion, and she wrote the letter which Piers received. All things were made new to her, above all her own self. She was acting in a way which was no result of balanced purpose, yet, as she perfectly understood, involved her in the gravest responsibilities. She had no longer the excuse which palliated her conduct 8 years ago. That heedlessness was innocent indeed, compared with the blame she would now incur if she excited a vain hope merely to prove her feelings, to read another chapter of life. Solemnly, in this charmed stillness of midnight, she searched her heart. It did not fail under question. A morning's sleep had held her so much later than usual that before she had left her chamber letters were brought to the door by the child who waited upon her. On one envelope she saw the doctor's handwriting, on the other that of her cousin, Mrs. Florio. Surprised to hear from Olga, with whom she had had very little communication for a year or two, she opened that letter first. "My dear Irene," it began, "something has lately come to my knowledge which I think I am only doing a duty in acquainting you with. It is very unpleasant, but not the first unpleasant piece of news that you and I have shared together. You remember all about Piers Otway, and those letters of my poor mother's, which he said he had bought for us from his horrid brother. Well, I find that he did not buy them, at all events that he never paid for them. Daniel Otway is now broken down in health, and depends on help from the other brother, Alexander, who has gone in for some sort of music-hall business. Not only did Piers cheat him out of the money promised for the letters, I fear there's no other word for it, but he has utterly refused to give the man a farthing, though in good circumstances, I hear. This is all very disagreeable, and I don't like to talk about it. But as I hear Piers Otway has been seeing you, it's better you should know." She added, "Very kind regards," and signed herself "Yours affectionately." Then came a postscript. "Mrs. A. Otway is actually on the music-hall stage herself, in short skirts." The paper shook in Irene's hand. She turned sick with fear and misery. Mechanically, the other letter was torn open. Dr. Derwent wrote about Eustace's engagement. It did not exactly surprise him. He had observed significant things. Nor did it exactly displease him, for since talking with Eustace and with Marian Jacks, the widow, he suspected that the match was remarkable for its fitness. Mrs. Jacks had a large fortune. Well, one could resign oneself to that. After all, Mademoiselle Wren, there's nothing to be uneasy about. Arnold Jacks is sure to marry very soon, a dowager duchess, I should say, and on that score there'll be no awkwardness. When the Wren makes a nest for herself, I shall convert this house into a big laboratory, and be at home only to bacteria. But the doctor, too, had a postscriptum. Olga has been writing to me. She is scandal. Something about the letters you wot of having been obtained in a dishonest way.
I won't say I believe it, or I disbelieve it. I mentioned the thing only to suggest that perhaps I was right in not making any acknowledgment of the obligation. I felt that silence was the wise as well as the dignified thing, though someone disagreed with me. When Irene entered the sitting-room, her friend had long since breakfasted. "What's the matter?" Helen asked, seeing so pale and troubled a countenance. "Oh, nothing much. I overtired myself yesterday. I must keep quiet for a little." Mrs. Borisoff herself was in no talkative frame of mind. She, too, an observer might have imagined, had some care or worry. The two very soon parted, Irene going back to her room, Helen out into the sunshine. A malicious letter, this of Olga's, the kind of letter which Irene had not thought her capable of penning. Could there be any substantial reason for such hostile feeling? Oh, how one's mind opened itself to dark suspicion when once an evil whisper has been admitted. She would not believe that story of duplicity, of baseness. Her very soul rejected it, declared it impossible, the basest calumny. Yet how it hurt! How it humiliated! Chiefly, perhaps, because of the evil art with which Olga had reminded her of Piers Otway's disreputable kinsman. Could the two elder brothers be so worthless, and the younger an honest, brave man, a man without reproach, her ideal? Irene clutched at the recollection which till now she had preferred to banish from her mind. Piers was not born of the same mother. Might he not inherit his father's finer qualities, and together with them something noble from the woman whom his father loved? Could she but know that history! The woman was a law-breaker. Repeatability gave her hard names. But Irene used her own judgment in such matters, and asked only for knowledge of facts. She had as good as forgotten the irregularity of Piers Otway's birth. Whom indeed did it or could it concern? Her father, least of all men, would dwell upon it as a subject of reproach. But her father was very capable of pointing to Daniel and Alexander with a shake of the head. He had a prejudice against Piers. This letter reminded her of it only too well. It might be feared that he was rather glad than otherwise of the sheer scandal that Olga had conveyed to him. Confident in his love of her, which would tell ill on the side of his reasonableness and his justice, she had not during these crucial days thought much about her father. She saw his face now if she spoke to him of Piers. Dr. Derwent, like all men of brains, had a good deal of the aristocratic temper. He scorned the vulgarity of the vulgar. He turned in angry impatience from such sorry creatures as those two men, and often lashed with his contempt the ignoble amusements of the crowd. Olga doubtless had told him of the singer in short skirts. She shed a few tears. The very meanness of the injury done her at this crisis of emotion heightened its cruelty. Piers might come to the castle this morning. Now and then she glanced from her window, if perchance she should see him approaching, but all she saw was a group of holiday-makers, the happily infrequent tourists who cared to turn from the beaten track up the dale to visit the castle. She did not know whether Helen was at home or had rambled away. If Piers came and his call was announced to her, could she go forth and see him? Not to do so would be unjust, both to herself and to him. The relations between them demanded of all things honesty and courage. No little courage, it was true, for she must speak to him plainly of things from which she shrank even in communing with herself. Yet she had done as hard a thing as this. Harder, perhaps, that interview with Arnold Jacks which set her free. Honesty and courage, clearness of sight and strength of purpose, where all but every girl would have drifted dumbly the common way, had saved her life from the worst disaster. Saved, too, the man whom her weakness would have wronged. Had she not learnt the lesson which life sets before all, but which only a few can grasp and profit by? Towards midday she left her room, and went in search of Helen.
Not finding her within doors, she stepped out onto the sward and strolled in the neighbourhood of the castle. A child whom she knew approached her. "Have you seen Mrs. Borisoff?" she asked. "She's down at the beck with the gentleman," answered the little girl, pointing with a smile to the deep, leaf-hidden glen half a mile away. Irene lingered for a few minutes and went in again. At luncheon-time Helen had not returned. The meal was delayed for her more than a quarter of an hour. When at length she entered, Irene saw that she had been hastening, but Helen's features seemed to betray some other cause of discomposure than mere unpunctuality. Having glanced at her once or twice, Irene kept an averted face. Neither spoke as they sat down to table. Only when they had begun the meal did Helen ask whether her friend felt better. The reply was a brief affirmative. For the rest of the time they talked a little absently about trivialities. Then they parted, without any arrangement for the afternoon. Irene's mind was in that state of perilous commotion which invests with dire significance any event not at once intelligible. Alone in her chamber, she sat brooding with tragic countenance. How could Helen's behaviour be explained? If she had met Piers Otway and spent part of the morning with him, why did she keep silence about it? Why was she so late in coming home? And what had heightened her colour, given that peculiar shiftiness to her eyes? She rose, went to Helen's door, and knocked. "May I come in?" "Oh, of course. I have a letter to write by post-time." "I won't keep you long," said Irene, standing before her friend's chair and regarding her with grave earnestness. "Did Mr. Otway call this morning?" "He was coming. I met him outside and told him you weren't very well. And she hesitated, but went on with a harder voice and a careless smile. "We had a walk up the glen. It's very lovely, the higher part. You must go. Ask him to take you." "I don't understand you," said Irene coldly. "Why should I ask Mr. Otway to take me?" "I beg your pardon. You are become so critical of words and phrases. To take us, I'll say." "That wouldn't be a very agreeable walk, Helen, while you're in this strange mood. What does it all mean? I never foresaw the possibility of misunderstanding such as this between us. Is it I who am to blame, or you? Have I offended you?" "No, dear," was the dreamy response. "Then why do you seem to wish to quarrel with me?" Helen had the look of one who strugglingly overcomes a paroxysm of anger. She stood up. "Would you leave me alone for a little, Irene? I'm not quite able to talk. I think we've both of us been doing too much, overtaxing ourselves. It has got on my nerves." "Yes, I will go," was the answer, spoken very quietly. "And tomorrow morning I will return to London." She moved away. "Irene." "Yes?" "I have something to tell you before you go." Helen spoke with a set face, forcing herself to meet her friend's eyes. "Mr. Otway wants an opportunity of talking with you, alone. He hoped for it this morning. As he couldn't see you, he talked about you to me, you being the only subject he could talk about. I promised to be out of the way if he came this afternoon." "Thank you. But why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because, as I said, things have rather got on my nerves." She took a step forward. "Will you overlook it? Forget about it. Of course I should have told you before he came." "It's strange that there should be anything to overlook or forget between us," said Irene, with wide, pathetic eyes. "Oh, there isn't really. It's not you and I that have got muddled. Only things, circumstances. If you had been a little more chummy with me. There's a time for silence, but also a time for talking." "Dear, there are things one can't talk about, because one doesn't know what to say, even to oneself." I know it," replied Helen with emphasis. and she came still nearer, with hand held out. "All nerves, Irene. Neuralgia of the common sense, my dear." They parted with a laugh and a quick clasp of hands. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of The Crown of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Crown of Life by George Gissing. Chapter 37. For half an hour Irene sat idle. She was waiting, and could do nothing but wait. Then the uncertainty as to how long this suspense might hold her grew insufferable. She was afraid, too, of seeing Helen again and having to talk, when talk would be a misery. A thought grew out of her unrest, a thought clear shining amid the tumult of turbid emotions. She would go forth and meet him. He should see that she came with that purpose, that she put away all trivialities of prescription and of pride. If he were worthy, only the more would he esteem her. If she deluded herself, it lay in the course of fate. His way up from Redmire was by the road along which she had driven on the evening of her arrival, the road that dipped into a wooded glen, where a stream tumbled amid rocks and boulders, over smooth worn slabs and shining pebbles, from the moor down to the river of the dale. He might not come this way. She hoped, she trusted destiny. She stood by the crossing of the beck. The flood of yesterday had fallen, the water was again shallow at this spot, but nearly all the stepping-stones had been swept away. For help at such times, a crazy little wooden bridge spanned the current a few yards above. Irene brushed through the long grass and the bracken, mounted on to the bridge, and leaning over the old bough which formed a rail, let the voice of the beck soothe her impatience. Here one might linger for hours in perfect solitude. Very rarely in the day was this happy stillness broken by a footfall, a voice, or the rumbling of a peasant's cart. A bird twittered, a breeze whispered in the branches. Ever and ever the water kept its hushing note. But now someone was coming, not with audible footstep, not down the road at which Irene frequently glanced. The intruder approached from the lower part of the glen, along the beckside, now walking in soft herbage, now striding from stone to stone, sometimes lifting the bough of a hazel or a rowan that hung athwart his path. He drew near to the crossing. He saw the figure on the bridge, and for a moment stood at gaze. Irene was aware of someone regarding her. She moved. He stood below, the ripple edge of the water touching his foot. Upon his upturned face, dark eyes wide in joy and admiration, firm lips wistfully subduing their smile, the golden sunlight shimmered through overhanging foliage. She spoke. "Everything around is beautiful, but this most of all." "There's nothing more beautiful," he answered, "in all the dales." The words had come to her easily and naturally, after so much trouble as to what the first words should be. His look was enough. She scorned her distrust, scorned the malicious gossip that had excited it. Her mind passed into consonance with the still, warm hour, with the loveliness of all about her. "I haven't been that way yet." She pointed up the glen. "Will you come?" "Gladly. I was here with Mrs. Borisoff this morning, and wished so much that you had been with us." Irene stepped down from the bridge, down to the beckside. The briefest shadow of annoyance had caused her to turn her face away. There followed contentment that he spoke of the morning at once and so frankly. She was able to talk without restraint, uttering her delight at each new picture as they went along. They walked very slowly, ever turning to admire, stopping to call each other's attention with glowing words. At a certain point they were obliged to cross the water, their progress on this side barred by natural obstacles. It was a crossing of some little difficulty for Irene, the stones being rugged and rather far apart.
Piers guided her, and at the worst spot held out his hand. "Jump! I won't let you fall." She sprang with a happy girlish laugh to his side, and withdrew her hand very gently. "Here's a good place to rest," she said, seating herself on a boulder, and Piers sat down at a little distance. The bed of the torrent was full of great stones, very white, rounded and smoothed by the immemorial flow, by their tumbling and grinding in time of spate. They formed innumerable little cataracts, with here and there a broad plunge of foam-streaked water, perilously swift and deep. By the bank the current spread into a large, still pool, of colour a rich brown where the sunshine touched it, and darkly green where it lay beneath spreading branches, everywhere limpid, showing the pebbles or the sand in its cool depths. Infinite were the varyings of light and shade, from a dazzling gleam on the middle water to the dense obscurity of leafy nooks. On either hand was a wood, thick with undergrowth. Great pines, spruces and larches, red-berried rowans crowding on the steep sides of the ravine, trees of noble stature, shadowing fern and flower, towering against the sunny blue. Just below the spot where Piers and Irene rested, a great lichened hazel stretched itself all across the beck. In the upward direction a narrowing vista, filled with every tint of leafage, rose to the brown of the moor and the azure of the sky. All about grew tall fruiting grasses, and many a bright flower, clusters of pink willow-weed, patches of yellow ragwort, the perfumed meadow-sweet, and amid bracken and bramble the purple shining of a great campanula. On the open moor the sun blazed with parching heat. Here was freshness as of spring, the waft of cool airs, the scent of verdure moistened at the root. "Once upon a time," said Otway, when both had been listening to their thoughts, "I fancied myself as unlucky a man as walked the earth. I've got over that." Irene did not look at him. She waited for the something else which his voice promised. "Think of my good fortune in meeting you this afternoon. If I had gone to the castle another way, I should have missed you. Yet I all but did go by the fields, and there was nothing I desired so much as to see you somewhere, by yourself." The slight failing of his voice at the end helped Irene to speak collectedly. "Chance was in my favour too. I came down to the beck, hoping I might meet you." She saw his hand move, the fingers clutched together. Before he could say anything, she continued, "I want to tell you of an ill-natured story that has reached my ears, not to discuss it. I know it's untrue. Your two brothers, do you know that they speak spitefully of you?" "I didn't know it. I don't think I have given them any cause." "I'm very sure you haven't. But I want you to know about it, and I shall tell you the facts. After the death of my aunt, Mrs. Hannaford, you got from the hands of Daniel Otway a packet of her letters. He bargained with you, and you paid his price, wishing those letters to be seen by my father and my cousin Olga, whose minds they would set at rest. Now, Daniel Otway is telling people that you never paid the sum you promised him, and that being in poverty, he vainly applies to you for help." She saw his hand grasp a twig that hung near him and drag it rudely down. She did not look at his face. "I should have thought," Piers answered with grave composure, "that nothing Daniel Otway said could concern me. I see it isn't so. It must have troubled you, for you to speak of it." "It has. I thought about it. I rejected it as a falsehood." "There's a double falsehood. I paid him the price he asked, on the day he asked it, and I have since—" He checked himself. "I have not refused him help in his poverty." Irene's heart glowed within her. Even thus, and not otherwise, would she have desired him to refute the slander. It was a test she had promised herself. She could have laughed for joy. Her voice betrayed this glad emotion. Oh, let him say what he will, it doesn't matter now. But how comes it that he is poor? That I should like to know. Piers threw a pebble into the still brown water near him. 5 years ago he came into a substantial sum of money. I suppose it went very quickly. Daniel is not exactly a prudent man. I imagine not, remarked Irene, allowing herself a glimpse of his countenance, which she found to be less calm than his tone. Let us have done with him. 5 years ago, she added with soft accents, some of that money ought to have been yours, and you received nothing. Nothing was legally due to me, he answered, in a voice lower than hers. That I know. I mention it, you will forgive me, because I have sometimes feared that you might explain to yourself wrongly my failure to reply when you sent me those verses long ago. I have thought lately that you might suppose I knew certain facts at that time. I didn't. I only learnt them afterwards. At no time would it have made any difference. Piers could not speak. Oh, look, said Irene in a whisper, pointing. A great dragonfly, a flash of blue, had dropped onto the surface of the pool and lay floating. As they watched, it rose to drop again upon a small stone amid a shallow current. Half in, half out of the sunny water, it basked. Oh, how lovely everything is, exclaimed Irene in a voice that quivered low. How perfect today. It was weather like this when I first saw you, said Piers. Earlier, but just as bright. My memory of you has always lived in sunshine. I saw you first from my window. You were standing in the garden at Ewell. I heard your voice. Do you remember telling the story of Thibault Rossignol? Oh, yes, yes. Is he still with your father? Thibault? Oh, why, Thibault is an institution. I can't imagine our house without him. Do you know that he always calls me Mademoiselle Irene? Your name is beautiful in any language. I wonder how many times I have repeated it to myself, and thought too so often of its meaning. Longed for that, and how vainly. Say the name now, she faltered. Irene, Irene. Why, you make music of it. I never knew how musical it sounded. Hush! Look at that thing of light and air. The dragonfly had flashed past them. This way and that it darted above the shining water, and then dropped once more, to float, to sail idly with its gossamer wings. Piers stole nearer. He sat on a stone by her side. Irene. Yes, I like the name when you say it. May I touch your hand? Still gazing at the dragonfly, as if careless of what she did, she held her hand to him. Piers folded it in both his own. May I hold it as long as I live? Is that a new thought of yours? She asked, in a voice that shook as it tried to suggest laughter in her mind. The newest, the most daring and the most glorious I ever had. Why, then I've been mistaken, she said softly, for an instant meeting his eyes. I fancied I owed you something for a wrong I did, without meaning it, more than 8 years gone by. That thought had come to you? Piers exclaimed, with eyes gleaming. Indeed it had. I shall be more than half sorry if I have to lose it. Oh, how foolish I was! What wild, monstrous folly! How could you have dreamt for a moment that such a one as I was could dare to love you? Irene, you did me no wrong. You gave me the ideal of my life, something I should never lose from my heart and mind, something to live towards. Not a hope. Hope would have been madness. I have loved you without hope, loved you because I found the only one I could love, the one I must love, on and on, to the end. She laid her free hand upon his that clasped the other, and bowed him to her reasoning mood. Let me speak of other things that have to be made plain between you and me. First of all, a piece of news. I have just heard that my brother is going to marry Mrs. John Jacks. Piers was mute with astonishment. It was so long since he had seen Mrs. Jacks, and he pictured her as a woman much older than Eustace Derwent. His clearest recollection of her was that remark she made at the luncheon table about the Irish, that they were so sentimental. It had blurred her beauty and her youth in his remembrance. Yes, Eustace is going to marry her, and I shouldn't wonder if the marriage turns out well. It leads to the disagreeable thing I have to talk about. You know that I engaged myself to Arnold Jacks. I did so freely, thinking I was right. When the time of the marriage drew near, I had learnt that I had done wrong. Not that I wished to be the wife of anyone else. I loved nobody. I did not love the man I was pretending to. As soon as I knew that, what was I to do? To marry him was a crime, no less a crime for its being committed every day. I took my courage in both hands. I told him I did not love him, and I would not marry him. And I ran away. The memory made her bosom heave, her cheeks flush. "Magnificent," commented the listener with a happy smile. "Oh, but I didn't do it very well. I treated him badly. Oh, yes, inconsiderately, selfishly. The thing had to be done, but there were ways of doing it. Unfortunately, I had got to resent my captivity, and I spoke to him as if he were to blame. From the point of view of delicacy, perhaps he was. He should have released me at once, and that he wouldn't. But I was too little regardful of what it meant to him, above all to his pride. I have so often reproached myself. I do it now for the last time. There." She picked up a pebble to fling away. "It's gone. We speak of the thing no more." A change was coming upon the glen. The sun had passed. It shone now only on the tree-tops, but the sky above was blue and warm as ever. "Another thing," she pursued more gravely. "My father." Piers waited a moment, and then said with eyes downcast, "He does not think well of me?" "That is my grief and my trouble. However, not a serious trouble. Of you personally he has no dislike. It was quite the opposite when he met you, when you dined at our house. You remember? He said things of you I am not going to repeat, sir. It was only after the disaster which involved your name. Then he grew prejudiced." "Well, who can wonder?" "It will pass over. My father is no stage tyrant. If he is not open to reason, what man living is? And no man has a tenderer heart. He was all kindness and forbearance and understanding when I did a thing which might well have made him angry. Some day you shall see the letter he wrote me when I had run away to Paris. In it he spoke to me as never before of his own marriage, of his love for my mother. Every word remains in my memory, but I can't trust my voice to repeat them, and perhaps I ought not, even to you." "May I go to him and speak for myself?" "Oh, yes, but not till I have seen him." "Can't I spare you that?" said Piers in a voice which for the first time sounded his triumphant manhood. "Do you think I fear a meeting with your father, or doubt of its result? If I had gone merely on my own account, to try to remove his prejudice and win his regard, it would have been a different thing. Indeed, I could never have done that. I felt too keenly his reasons for disliking me. But now, in what man's presence should I shrink and feel myself unworthy? You have put such words into my heart as will gain my cause for me the moment they are spoken. I have no false shame, no misgivings. I shall speak the truth of myself and you, and your father will hear me." Irene listened with the love-light in her hazel eyes. The face she turned upon him brought back a ray of sunshine to the slowly shadowing glen. "I will think till tomorrow," she said. "Come to the castle tomorrow morning, and I shall have settled many things. But now we must go. Helen will wonder what has become of me. I didn't tell her I was going out." He bent over her hand, and she did not withdraw it from him as they walked through the bracken and beneath the green boughs, and picked their way over the white stones of the rushing beck. At the road they parted. An hour after sunset, Piers was climbing the hillside towards the castle, now a looming shape against a sky still duskily purpled from the west. He climbed slowly, doubting at each step whether to go nearer or to wave his hand and turn. Still he approached. In the cottages a few lights were seen, but no one moved. There was no voice. His own footstep on the sward fell soundless. He stood before the tower which was inhabited, and looked at the dim lighted windows. To the entrance led a long flight of steps, and as he gazed through the gloom, he seemed to discern a figure standing there, before the doorway. He was not mistaken. The figure moved, descended. Motionless, he saw it turn towards him. Then he knew the step, the form. He sprang forward. "Irene!" "Oh, you have come to say good night? Oh, see how our thoughts chime. I guessed you would." Her voice had a soft, caressing tremor. Her hand sought his. "Irene, you have given me a new life, a new soul." Her lips were near as she answered him. "Rest from your sorrows, my dearest. I love you. I love you." He was alone again in the darkness, on the hillside. He heard the voice of the far-off river, and to his rapturous mood it sounded as a moaning, brought a sudden sadness. All at once he thought amid his triumph of those unhappy ones whom the glory of love would never bless, those men and women born to a vain longing such as he had known, doomed to the dread solitude from which he by miracle had been saved. His heart swelled, and his eyes were hot with tears. But as he went down to the dale, the calm of the silent hour crept over him. He whispered the beloved name, and it gave him peace, such peace as follows upon the hallowing of a profound passion, justified of reason, and proof under the hand of time. End of chapter 37. End of The Crown of Life.